Coming up on Arirang News, a report from the South Korean Finance Ministry shows a pickup in production and consumption. For the first time in 8 months, the report does not describe the economy as stagnating. The U.S. defense chief calls on South Korea not to cancel its military intel sharing pact with Japan. In high-level talks, he also calls on Seoul to pay more for the stationing of American troops. And North Korea tells the South that it's going to tear down South Korean facilities at a mountain resort in the north if Seoul doesn't send crews to remove them itself. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The U.S. has urged South Korea to keep its intel sharing pact with Japan, while calling on Seoul to pay more for the cost of stationing U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula. Kim Min-ji has more from the annual South Korea-U.S. Security Consultative meeting that took place in Seoul earlier today.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper called on South Korea and Japan to work together to renew their bilateral military intel sharing pact, GSOMIA. Speaking Friday at a joint press conference with South Korea's Defense Minister Chung Kyung-do following their annual Security Consultative meeting, the Pentagon chief said that ending GSOMIA will only benefit North Korea and China, calling it an important tool, especially in times of war. GSOMIA is set to automatically expire on November 23rd, after Seoul announced its intent to withdraw from the pact in August, after Japan slapped export curbs on South Korea, citing a breach of trust and security issues. The U.S. has been pushing South Korea to extend the agreement, saying it's vital to trilateral security cooperation and to dealing with regional threats. But Seoul continues to insist that it can only reconsider if Japan first changes course. On the issue of sharing the cost of stationing American troops on the Korean Peninsula, Esper said that South Korea is a wealthy country and that it can and should pay more. He didn't elaborate, however, on any figures. The two allies are currently in talks, with Washington reportedly calling on Seoul to pay nearly $5 billion a year, which is more than 5 times the amount South Korea agreed to pay under the current deal. Seoul's defense chief said that the two sides agreed to decide on a figure that's fair and acceptable to both South Korea and the U.S. The two sides also reaffirmed their joint goal of achieving North Korea's complete denuclearization and of building lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula, noting the need to be flexible in adjusting their joint military drills to support ongoing diplomatic efforts with Pyongyang. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, President Moon Jae-in has just begun talks with U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper and Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Mark Milley. According to the presidential office, the discussions will take place at the Blue House for half an hour. The two sides are likely to continue with the discussions from the SCM earlier today, exchanging views on some sensitive issues like GSOMIA. President Moon's expected to reiterate his administration's stance that its decision to withdraw from the agreement cannot be reversed unless Tokyo changes its attitude toward their bilateral and historical disputes. Other possible issues include defense cost sharing for American troops in Korea, as well as joint military exercises. We'll have more details in our next newscast. North Korea says it's willing to resume working-level talks with the U.S. on its nuclear program, just as long as Washington comes forward with a fundamental solution. Hong Yoo reports.
North Korea revealed on Thursday that the U.S. has offered to resume nuclear negotiations in December. But the regime turned the offer down, saying it was not interested in talks that are only held to appease them before a year-end deadline set by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for Washington to offer an acceptable deal. North Korean negotiator Kim Myung-gil, who delivered the statement released by state media, added deals that offer an end to the Korean War or establishing a liaison office between the countries are of secondary importance. He said they are ready to meet the U.S. at any place and any time if Washington offers a fundamental solution. In response, the U.S. State Department said President Trump is committed to advancing the commitments promised at last year's summit in Singapore. The mention of nuclear talks comes after negotiations ground to a halt following a recent unsuccessful meeting in Stockholm. Following that meeting, North Korea accused the U.S. of approaching the talks with an old stance and attitude. The North Korean negotiator also criticized his U.S. counterpart's idea of contacting him through a third party over any suggestions for dialogue. Kim Young-chul, another senior North Korean official, also released a statement through the regime state media late Thursday regarding what U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper said about the possibility of altering joint military exercises in South Korea if it helps advance a diplomatic deal with North Korea. Kim Young-chul said he hopes Esper meant to completely halt the joint drills and added he thinks the comments reflect President Trump's thinking and was part of the U.S. side's positive efforts to revive momentum for talks. Hong-yu, Arirang News.
South Korea's unification minister Kim Yeon-chul has suggested North Korea and the U.S. consider an Olympics armistice. Speaking to the Washington Post ahead of his trip to the U.S. this weekend, Kim said the armistice would entail Pyongyang suspending missile tests and the U.S. suspending joint military exercises with South Korea during the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. He also proposed, as a means of confidence building, that the U.S. ease its ban on traveling to North Korea so that Americans of Korean origin might visit their relatives in the North. His main message was that progress on denuclearization must go hand in hand with developments in inter-Korean relations. And another big announcement from North Korea this morning. The North says it has sent a final notice to South Korea that it will demolish Seoul's facilities at the Mount Geumgang resort if South Korea doesn't do so itself. This was the regime's response to Seoul's suggestion last week that it send a team to first take stock of the situation. Arirang's Unification Ministry correspondent Oh Jung-hee reports.
An ultimatum from North Korea. Pyongyang's state-run Korean Central News Agency says the regime sent a final notice to South Korea this Monday that it'll go ahead and unilaterally tear down South Korean facilities at the Mount Geumgang resort if Seoul doesn't do it. The North says South Korea doesn't seem to understand its demand and keeps on mentioning other options like a creative approach, working-level talks, and an investigation team visit to the North. The regime accused Seoul of ignoring its facilities for the past 10 years and only now trying to take action. It stressed there's no room for South Korea in regards to tours to Mount Geumgang and that the mountain is not something shared by the two sides. The North reiterated that the regime will take responsibility and develop the Mount Geumgang area as an international tourist destination. On Friday, the South Korean government confirmed that it received such a notice from the North early this week.
On November 11th, the North once again claimed that the two sides discussed the removal of South Korean facilities through written exchanges, saying it's the last warning.
The North didn't clearly state the deadline for Seoul to come and remove its buildings. Seoul still believes the issue of the Mount Geumgang tours should be talked about by the two sides and called on the North to respond to Seoul's stance.
We are discussing the matter with the firms that ran businesses at the tourist resort. In finding a solution to this, our basic stance is that we have to protect South Korean firms' property rights and things have to be mutually agreed by the two sides.
The government did not reveal when it'll send a reply to the North's notice. It says it'll make additional announcements once there's some progress in their exchanges. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
A United Nations committee has adopted a resolution calling for accountability for North Korea's grave human rights violations. Lee Seung-jae has more.
On Thursday, the UN Third Committee, which oversees humanitarian issues around the world, passed a resolution calling for accountability for the ongoing and gross human rights violations taking place in North Korea. The document was passed by consensus without a vote for the 15th year in a row. According to the text drafted by EU member states, the UN condemns the long-standing and ongoing systematic, widespread, and gross violations of human rights in and by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, including those that may amount to crimes against humanity. The resolution also calls for the UN Security Council to take appropriate action to ensure accountability by considering referring the North Korean situation to the International Criminal Court and consider further sanctions to target those who appear to be most responsible for human rights violations, an apparent reference to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The EU countries and 40 other members countries, including the United States, Canada, and Japan, participated in the joint proposal. Some countries, including China and Russia, did not join the consensus, but did not demand a vote. While South Korea joined the consensus, it did not participate in the joint proposal. South Korea participated in the joint proposal from 2008 until last year. This year's resolution largely contains the same language as those of previous years and is expected to pass the UN General Assembly next month. 이승재, Arirang News.
South Korea's finance ministry has released its monthly assessment of the economy, and this time there are bright spots in production, consumption, and jobs. Kim Hae-sung has the details.
The Ministry of Economy and Finance has omitted the word sluggish from its monthly Green Book report for the first time in 8 months. It said in the third quarter the Korean economy has been supported by growth in production and consumption, but that a decrease in exports and construction investment hinders growth. Manufacturing production went up 2% on month in September, while services production went down 1.2%. Facilities investment increased near 3% on month in September thanks to higher investment in machinery and equipment. But construction investment fell by about 3%. Exports continued to fall for the 11th consecutive month in October on slowing global trade and falling chip prices, dropping near 15% on year. In its November monthly Green Book, the Finance Ministry said the job market is on a recovery path with the number of newly added jobs on the rise. Korea added 419,000 new jobs on year in October, adding more than 300,000 new jobs for the third consecutive month, thanks to new jobs in health and social welfare for those above 60. The unemployment rate also fell to 3%. Externally, the Finance Ministry said the global economy is slowing down with ongoing uncertainties over the U.S.-China trade dispute and Japan's export restrictions on South Korea. It said it will strive to manage risks, including Japan's export curbs, and use its resources to help boost private consumption. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
South Korea has been steadily increasing its direct investment in the ASEAN countries, but the latest figures show that amount is dwarfed by what Japan's pouring in. Kim Jae-hee has the details.
The Korea International Trade Association says South Korea poured $6.1 billion into ASEAN last year, up 16.7% from the previous year. The country's direct investment in ASEAN was only $4.4 billion in 2010, but it has been expanding quickly ever since. South Korean companies that have operations in the ASEAN market say steady demand for South Korean products and cheaper labor were the main reasons for their entry. However, South Korea is not the only country boosting its investments into the rapidly developing Southeast Asia region. Total direct investment in ASEAN has risen from $21.8 billion in 2000 to over $148 billion last year. South Korea, China, and Japan have all upped their investments. In fact, last year, the three countries accounted for almost a quarter of total direct investment into ASEAN. In terms of the proportions of that total, while South Korea's increased from 2.4 to 4.3%, China's direct investment amounted to 8% of the total. Japan's investment accounted for 12.3% in 2018, which is around 3 times more than South Korea's. Analysts say that with the uncertainties surrounding the global trade environment, ASEAN is forecast to take a more important role in the years to come. Therefore, they suggest South Korea strengthen not only exports but also imports to achieve profitable results in the ASEAN market in the long run. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
The leaders of the BRICS group of major emerging economies have reaffirmed their commitment to multilateralism and free trade. In their joint declaration made Thursday local time in Brasilia, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, vowed to overcome significant challenges facing multilateralism and called for urgent reform of international organizations, including the UN, WTO, and the IMF. They underlined the importance of what they called open, free, and inclusive international trade and urged all WTO members to avoid unilateral and protectionist measures. They also said they support a peaceful diplomatic and political solution to the challenges surrounding the Korean Peninsula, and they support complete denuclearization. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Friday, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Se-won, professor of economics at Ewha Women's University. Dr. Kim, thank you for making time today.
Good afternoon, Devin.
So today the Finance Ministry released its latest Green Book report on the economy, showing production and consumption continuing to rise, but exports and construction investment are still contracting. What stands out to you in this report?
Well, today's Green Book gave a broadly speaking negative picture on Korean economy. That means Korean government seriously sees the current economic situation. They say that in the third quarter of this year, production and consumption is maintaining increasing trend, but export decreased by over 14% and construction investment decreased over 3%. And altogether, these situations restrict Korean economic growth. And today's Green Book evaluates Korean economy is under recession over 8 straight months.
Right. Well, of course, outlooks for growth in the Korean economy this year have been steadily going down. But this week, the Korea Development Institute estimated growth for next year at 2.3%, which would be an improvement. What do you think of that outlook?
KDI, the major economic think tank of government, expects this year's economic growth will be 2%. However, they expect next year's economic growth will be slightly higher at 2.3% due to improvements in domestic demand and export. Basically, they see that the domestic demand and export situation of next year couldn't be worse than this year. And they also support government's expansionary fiscal policy, but gave warning on increasing government debt in the near future.
Right. Well, switching gears, President Trump says he'll hit China with big tariffs if they don't end up signing this Phase 1 trade deal. How do you see that playing out?
It looks that U.S.-China trade deal is close, but Mr. Trump is not ready to sign off soon. Negotiators of the two countries have been working to come up with a written Phase 1 trade deal, but they got stuck over specifying China's agricultural imports items and quantity from the United States. That made Mr. Trump government a little bit stressed.
Right. Well, despite the uncertainty there that you reference with China trade, global stocks did move higher this week. Korean stocks, too, were less affected than one might have expected. The question everybody's asking is, how long can this go on?
Sluggish U.S.-China trade negotiation would be one of the largest burdens of global economy today. So the possibility of Phase 1 deal is a good news to global equity market. But at the same time, Mr. Trump's denial on it gave negative impact on the market. So the mixture of negative and positive signs sustained the global equity market this week. And Kospi of Korea slightly gained this week because of that. I think this situation goes on until Mr. Trump finally sign off the deal with China.
Got it. Well, another China factor is the protests in Hong Kong, which seem to be getting ever more violent. Stocks there, of course, have taken a major hit. But we have Alibaba getting ready to do a secondary listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. What do you think that's going to do to that market?
Hong Kong is experiencing serious economic and political instability related to democratic protest. And Hang Seng Index of Hong Kong dropped over 2% from the beginning of the week. But actually, Hong Kong's financial market works normally with all these chaotic situations. Hong Kong's financial market particularly stock market exchange, is extremely important to Chinese economy because more than 1,000 Chinese huge and public corporations are enlisted in Hong Kong's stock market. Alibaba is already enlisted in New York Stock Exchange, but they will do another IPOs in Hong Kong's equity market, and sooner or later, and that of course will give a positive impact on Hong Kong's equity market.
Indeed, that does seem likely. Dr. Kim, all right, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Now, Samsung Electronics' market share in Japan is on the rise this year. According to market research firm Strategy Analytics, on Friday, Korea's tech giant sold 500,000 smartphones in Japan in the third quarter, putting it second in terms of market share. Its share came to 6.7%, which is lower than the quarter before, when it reached a 6-year high of around 10%, but it was still about 3 times higher than a year ago. Apple's iPhone remained the most popular model in Japan with a market share of more than 60%. South Korea's biggest annual event for video game enthusiasts has kicked off in Busan. This expo presents the latest developments in the industry as well as business opportunities for developers. Lee Min-sun takes us to GStar 2019.
One of the most anticipated events for game lovers and developers is back in Busan on Thursday. Back for the 15th year, global game exhibition GStar 2019 has opened for its 4-day run at Busan's PEXCO Convention Center. South Korea's largest global game convention is a chance to check on the present and the future of the gaming industry.
The gaming industry is one of the fastest changing markets, and we are putting in efforts to deal with such changes. Mobile is the mainstream platform, but it's important to deal with other, newer platforms like AR or MR.
Under the slogan of Experience the New, over 3,200 booths have been set up by some 690 game companies from 36 countries. In addition to game exhibitions, business consulting sessions, and conferences, organizers have tried to create more interactive events for visitors. Visitors can play games with professional gamers, take part in a cosplay competition, or buy merchandise from their favorite games. The highlight of the GStar convention is the release of new games. Fans can visit different booths and be one of the very first players to try out the latest releases. Game companies from around the world are taking the opportunity to showcase their latest games to the public and get first-hand reactions and feedback. One of South Korea's major game companies, Netmarble, is showcasing 4 mobile games, including a multiplayer online role-playing game. It has prepared some 250 devices for visitors to try new games.
I've participated in GStar for 8 years. Since the game trend is shifting from PC to mobile games, I came to check those out.
The advances in ICT technology are also starting to bring changes to the game industry. One of South Korea's telecommunications companies participated in GStar for the first time. It presented its 5G-enabled real-time streaming game service, which allows users to enjoy games on mobile phones without downloading and installing the game. Alongside the game convention, a cultural content forum took place to discuss ways to expand exchanges between Korea, China, and Japan. The 3 countries have agreed to hold a joint esports competition in 2020 in an effort to further strengthen cultural exchanges. Lee Min-sun, Arirang News, Busan.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.